Next, I want to talk about regions and what we call realms. So this is a figure from our world geography textbook showing these different realms or ways of we spatially organize areas of the earth. Maybe one way to think about these are global neighborhoods, so to speak. These, like, say, North America here, Canada, primarily Canada and the US, or maybe South America here. These are places that share combinations of characteristics, both physical and human. And one thing that we'll look at through the semester is some of these are what we call monocentric realms, meaning they're dominated by a major country. So for example, in the Russia Central Asian realm, Russia is a big dominant country there. Some are what we call polycentric, meaning that it's a collection of relatively equal countries, like in Europe or Southeast Asia. There's no one big dominant country. So here's a closer view of that. This is the Russia Central Asian realm, clearly dominated by Russia, so we call it monocentric. Or we have maybe Southeast Asia, where we have a collection of relatively equal countries, so we call it polycentric. And within these realms, we can divide them into regions. And regions are places that, this is a general term in geography for areas that share some kind of characteristics. So we have these big realms, and these can be divided into regions. So these are the realms that will be, this is a framework for looking at. They coincide with the chapters in the book. And these are subregions within those realms. Here's another example of regions. This is world climate regions. So each color indicates a different kind of climate. That what this has in common is those areas share a desert climate. These areas share a cold climate, and so on. And there's different types of regions, but they all have a few things in common with each other. They all have air, and some of these are kind of intuitive, but let's go over them. They all have an area, they occupy space. They all have boundaries that we can we can map these regions. And they'll have a location, that they have both absolute latitude and longitude and relative location. Now, we can look at regions in different ways. There's sort of kind of two big types. One is what we think of as just sort of normal regions. We call these homogeneous regions. We call these formal regions, and formal regions are homogeneous, meaning that formal regions, they are areas that share characteristics like the climate region example. They are defined because these are areas that share they're homogeneous. They share some common characteristic. Whatever it is that you're measuring, be it climate or language or whatever it is that you're basing your regions on. There's a second type, though, called a functional region. And functional regions are defined by activity. So, for example, if we look at San Francisco and the surrounding communities where people commute to San Francisco, we can kind of put a boundary around that and call it the San Francisco commuting area. However, it's not homogeneous. San Francisco is not the same as Gilroy or the same as, Bacaville or some other outlying community where people commute to San Francisco. So these areas are not all the same, but they are linked by activity.